All right, we're going to do a little Ron Reagan and the conservative revolution in government as a result of his election in 1980. So let's go ahead and go to the election itself. 1980, Ronald Reagan soundly defeats Jimmy Carter. What does he get? He gets 41% of the popular vote. Carter, that is, gets 41% of the popular vote and 9% of the electoral vote. Reagan is elected on a fairly substantial electoral landslide. The popular vote, he gets 50.7%, so it's not a popular vote landslide, but it is an electoral landslide. Part of the support behind Reagan is the moral majority, a traditionalist, conservative Christian wing that is attempting to change the electoral process. They register new voters. They raise a lot of money. At least for 1980, they raise a lot of money, and that's part of what's behind Reagan too. But another really important part of what's behind Reagan is reducing taxes, cutting federal income taxes, and also cutting federal expenditures, significantly cutting federal expenditures on welfare, on food stamps, on aid to families with dependent children. The idea is that if you increase the economy, then everyone will be better off, although this cartoon suggests that the aged and the poor do not get much help from trickle down. Here is a stunning graph that encapsulates fairly quickly. Here's 1980, and here is the tax rates previous to that on the top one and above earners, and after that, huge tax cuts. A little bit of a jump there later on, but for the most part, it goes down from 71 to 34, from 60 to 33. Note, however, in this middle tier, taxes actually go up. Anyway, one of the big ideas in the Reagan Revolution is cutting taxes. Another big idea in the Reagan Revolution is deregulating. During the New Deal, there starts to be created a large federal regulatory apparatus because unregulated business had led to the Great Depression, or at least that was thinking at the time. So by the 1980s, Americans are viewing the regulation of the economy as a bad thing. It's stifling competition, it's stifling economic growth. So one way this comes to fruition is in the banking industry. During the Great Depression, they separated banking. They separated personal banking from commercial banking, and then in the 1980s, banks were allowed to combine operations. And this little cartoon shows one version of that. But basically, banks are able to take more risk. The same banks that have personal savings accounts are also able to now start doing investment banking. And as a result of taking on that greater risk, there's a slew of bank failures, the most bank failures since the Great Depression. So this regulation had taken some of the risk out of banking and made the banking industry more stable, but the argument was on the other side that it stifled competition, it stifled economic increase. So under Reagan, there's deregulation. Now, in the case of the banking industry, it cost taxpayers a lot of money. This is based on a study here at the FDIC, which is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And at least for the thrift crisis of 1989, taxpayers were on the hook for $124 billion. So deregulation doesn't always develop in ways that benefit the American taxpayer. However, overall, Americans felt like things were much better under Ronald Reagan. Maybe the greatest presidential ad ever. It's Morning in America is unveiled for his 1984 election, and here we have a pretty significant landslide. The electoral vote, 97.6%. Mondale only carried his home state of Minnesota. And in the in the popular vote, 58.8%. That is a significant popular vote majority. That's a mandate. Reagan was popular during his time period. And for Republicans today, Reagan is still incredibly popular. Another aspect of Reagan's administration was, though, he's a hardcore Cold Warrior. He calls the Soviet Union the evil empire, and he ratchets up the Cold War considerably. He tries to implement the Strategic Defense Initiative, and he has a lot of defense spending in his administration. He also asked Gorbachev to tear down the wall. By this point, the Soviet Union is old and their leaders are dying. Andropov in office for a very short period of time, Chernenko in office for an even shorter period of time, and then Mikhail Gorbachev comes along. He's a relatively young communist, and he sees the system as not working, so he starts to implement a couple reforms. One is called Glasnost, the other one is called Perestroika, and collectively what it does is it allows for dissent, it allows for changes. The first real changes happen in Eastern Europe, and then they cascade across the Soviet Union. Eventually, in the past, had there been unrest in Eastern Europe, the Soviets probably would have sent in troops and quashed that rebellion, but under Gorbachev and Glasnost, he allows for dissent, and this leads to the downfall of East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and eventually to the Soviet Union. Now, is this a result of Gorbachev's changes, or is this a result of Reagan's hardline policies? Well, that's what history is. It's an interpretation. But most definitely, Gorbachev's policies were extremely important. The other part of this is, though, that Reagan does increase defense spending considerably. So right in here is what we call the Reagan bump, right? We have Cold War spending going up and up and up and up. It goes down a little bit after Vietnam, and then when Reagan gets into office, you have incredible increases in defense spending. Now, here's kind of an interesting part. Reagan campaigned on lowering taxes, but he also campaigned on this tough anti-communist policy. What ends up happening under Reagan is we get a massive increase in the national debts, mostly because of military spending and tax breaks for the wealthy, and then also Congress didn't bring about the cuts that Reagan wanted. There's some trade deficit stuff going on in here, and here's this 1985, the debtor nation. This is just a reflection of the decreasing power of the American economy, kind of starting with the 1970s and the OPEC embargo that was mentioned earlier in the PowerPoint that I don't discuss in this little rant. Maybe the most significant long-term development in Reagan's administration is the creation of the Americans for Tax Reform. This is still the animating principle of the Republican Party today, at least a strong wing of the Republican Party, that any politician was pressured into signing the commitment to oppose and vote against tax increases. Grover Norquist is still around. You will see him on talk shows every once in a while if you watch those things. Since that time, as you guys are probably well aware, the debt has increased. So this is federal debt by presidents. Of course, this comes from U.S. Treasury data. And the other thing that we're having is a lot more money being spent. So under George W. Bush, we fund some wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's an economic crisis under George W. Bush, and the government bailout of that economic crisis is under the Obama administration. And so since Carter, we've had increasing deficits, increasing debt under all our presidents. But we also have had, what is this? Oh, goodness. Debt as a percentage of GDP. So our debt is getting bigger than our economy. Hasn't been that way since World War II. Again, we've cut taxes. So what do we have? We have deficit surplus. And where is 1980? 1980 is right in here. Something happens along the way. Right in here, this is Clinton. We had a brief budgetary surplus, but since 1980, the federal government has spent more than it's brought in. So to recap, under Ronald Reagan, the new conservative wing of the Republican Party gains ascendance. They focus on reducing taxes, on reducing size of the federal government, and deregulating the economy. Unfortunately, this has also brought about increasing deficits because of the lower tax revenue. So we can debate whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. But definitely under Ronald Reagan, you have an emphasis on lower taxes, on decreasing the size of the federal government, on deregulating industry, and you also have a legacy of large defense spending. And when you put all those things together, you start to see some of these deficits. And I'm not going to mention anything about, let's say from about, let's call it 21st century. We'll just leave that out there. But this is the Reagan Revolution. Lower taxes, decrease the size of the federal government, and decrease the regulatory state.